kind of a steady state of people. So I think we should get started. I'm Alexis Knob. I am the project manager for the Physics and Astronomy Sea Change project. And today we're having a webinar on the AAAS Sea Change project and what they're hoping to do with the departmental awards. I will put the link in the chat window, though I'm sure it's all over their slides with this AAAS Sea Change website. And so the way things are going to go is Shirley Malcom will be our first speaker and talk a lot about why we need these kind of processes for equity, diversity, and inclusion. There will be about 5 minutes after to ask some questions. Beth Ruedi will talk more specifically about the departmental sea change work. There will be about 5 minutes after her talk and to ask some specific questions, and then the floor will be open for broader Q&A regarding sea change, diversity, equity, inclusion. This is also being recorded. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat window. You can direct message me too if you want to ask questions. We can also use the Q&A, but chat window is just as good. And so without further ado, let Shirley Malcom take things over.
Thank you. Beth is controlling my slides. It's good to have everybody here, and it's great to be able to talk to you for a little bit. Now, I know that title seems a little bit strange, but I think that it'll become a lot clearer to you as I go along. Okay, Beth, first slide. I was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, and I'm old enough that a lot of you know what that means. We had segregated schools, and I was only ever taught by Black teachers. I only ever went to school with other Black kids. That's my sister, Sandra Ann there. We called her Ann. And that was kind of the frame for the way that I grew up in the Jim Crow South. Next slide. When people ask me, in some cases, like, how did I get into science? And I said that context matters, and that for me, that there were two issues that have shaped everything that I have ever done in my career. One is the civil rights movement. Birmingham was the epicenter for civil rights in the 1960s. This particular picture on the left is that of Bethel Baptist Church. This was my mother and grandmother's church. This was 1956 when Bethel was bombed. We lived about 3 blocks from the church, and I tell people I can still hear the noise of the bombing in my head. It was Christmas night of 1956, and it was really amazing that you're in school, you're going to school every day and what have you, but you're also in the middle of the struggle for civil rights, and that colors everything else that happens to you. On the right, you have the other thing that really made the biggest difference in my life, and that was the launch of Sputnik in 1957. Because it was then that we started to pay attention to science education, where I had real science classes, that we were all just captivated by this satellite and the idea that somehow there was this thing that was human-made that was circling the Earth. We had a lot of questions in our science class in Lewis School. And a lot of those questions really had a lot to do with physics and the physics that actually was required to answer them. Next slide. As I said that, when the church was bombed, it was an amazing point in the civil rights, but it wasn't something that was at a distance. The picture there is my grandmother, um, who was hugging her pastor, Reverend Shuttlesworth. And if you look down in the corner there on the right, that's me. This was not something that it was at as a distance. This was something where that affected our daily lives, and this was something that we lived and experienced. Next slide. I said that had my science classes at Lewis School. I had gone to Hudson School, but moved to Lewis School when I was in the sixth grade, which is when the whole Sputnik thing actually took off. And Lewis was, as I said, an all-black school with all-black teachers, and it was a time when we had the opportunity to try to learn about what was um, what made the world work. Um, Next slide. This is my high school, um, Carver High School. Um, it is now an EPA Superfund site. Um, Lots of reasons that relate to environmental justice, or maybe in this case, injustice with regard to plant sightings and what have you, that rendered this land and this area where that I called home, Collegeville, uh, essentially uninhabitable now. Next slide. Carver High School in 1963 was a place that was not like most people's senior year. We didn't have prom. We didn't, because we did have martial law. We had many of the students from our classes who left to go down and march in the Children's March, which became a turning point for civil rights within Birmingham. Um, so it was a very different kind of a time. Next slide. When I left Carver High School, I kind of made a 180 and went to the University of Washington, which was as different in the other direction as Carver was. I went into an environment that was almost totally white students, for sure, white faculty, and really had real deficiencies that I discovered with regard to my own preparation. And I think that I was not atypical. I tell people that I don't think that the people who were running the schools or running the school system ever thought that a little black girl from Birmingham would ever have any need for advanced courses that could lead to her becoming a scientist. Now, I raise this as an issue because, as I said to you before, the major turning point in terms of my deciding that I wanted to go into science was really related to the fact that of Sputnik's launch. And as kids, we were making our own kind of rockets, and not the ones that fired. We'd get into all kinds of trouble around that. But we were asking questions that were totally questions that were relevant to understanding the physical world. How did the satellite get into orbit? What did it take for it to escape gravity? And we were talking about all these kinds of things. But when I had taken physics in high school, um, and I remember because it seemed so incongruous, when I had been taking physics in high school, we didn't have any equipment. As I said, they didn't think that any of us were going to ever need any of this stuff. We didn't have the equipment to do experiments and things like this. We just had books. And the books were old books that we had gotten from the white school. And the books made no sense to me whatsoever. So remember, the title that I gave you was Sailboats, Eastlake, and Other Imponderables. I told you it was imponderable as to why they would want to teach us about vectors by using sailboats. We knew nothing about sailboats. Black people didn't sail. We had very little, we didn't have lakes around us. We had a creek that would overflow, but we didn't, not so none of this made any sense. So the kinds of the ways that we were being taught were totally inappropriate in terms of our really being able to gain an understanding. So if anybody, you had a chance to try to lure me into studying physics, but I just had no desire to go someplace where I could not find any kind of understanding. And I don't think that this is that different from what we find today. Next slide. We look at I love the numbers, and when I look at the numbers tell a depressing story. Because if you look at the numbers of bachelor's degrees, for example, by race, ethnicity, and gender, which is the only way that I ever want to look at them, because you learn a lot that way. First of all, you see that there's been growth in bachelor's degrees over time, and yet that growth has not been that great for any women. Essentially, it is not a matter of having kept up at all. And if you look down there, all of that stuff down there at the bottom, those are women of color. So you can see that in some cases, the lines actually curve down, which it means that we have lost ground. Next slide. So instead of numbers, here we have we see distribution, proportions, and again losing ground with all of that muddy stuff, that murky stuff at the bottom, being women of color. Next slide. So we go then to the PhD level. The reason that I always look at the PhD data, people always ask me why, is because I'm trying to figure out where we're going to get our faculty. And we don't have much faculty diversity either. When I was at the University of Washington, there were two women, I think, in the entirety of the physics department, and no African Americans, Latinx people, none whatsoever. Um, and very few of us actually in the physics classes per se, but for sure not among the teaching faculty. And again, all that stuff at the bottom, women of color. Next slide. So again, we look at the 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 fact here that most of the people um, here, the distribution, heavily uh, white and male, the dashed purple line, and international men, the dashed red line. But all the women of color down there at the bottom, and very few white women either. Next slide. So go to physics, to astronomy and astrophysics. We see again very little few people down there at the bottom. Hadn't changed that much over time. Next slide. And by the distribution of bachelor's degrees in astronomy and astrophysics. Next slide. And here again, the PhDs. And because the numbers are small, they bounce all over the place. But in the next slide, essentially is the same picture. Very few people, very few PhDs coming out. That means very few who are going to be available for faculty. Next slide. And we wonder why this is the case. All right. I want to read this to you. This is a paragraph from a letter on entitled that appeared in Science. That was signed by, I think, over 1,000 people. Systemic racism in higher education. Everyone in academia must acknowledge the role that universities, faculty, staff, and students play in perpetuating structural racism by subjecting students of color to unwelcoming academic cultures. Universities are not level playing fields where all students have an equal opportunity to participate and succeed. The misuse of standardized tests, such as GRE, excludes students who could have otherwise succeeded. Once admitted, Black, Indigenous, and people of color face challenges when transitioning to college life and are more likely to be non-traditional students. Now, the things in red, I started doing this with another presentation, are the barriers. These are the things that have to be overcome. These are the things that have to be identified first before they can be overcome. And then we move to the green. Red means stop, green means go. Innovative pedagogies and programs can overcome these challenges, but are not widely applied in higher education. Evidence-based, institution-wide approaches focused on equity in student learning are foundational to eliminating structural racism in higher education. Once we abandon the view of fixed student ability, more Black, Indigenous, people of color students will succeed. Now, I think that I hope my story illustrated what I was talking about. That we have opportunities to draw students into your fields, but once they are there, we have to provide welcoming, supportive environments for them to stay there. We have to provide the kind of pedagogy that they're responsive to. We have to provide culturally responsive pedagogy and culturally relevant examples that they can use in order to be enabled to be successful. They need evidence-based, institution-wide approaches that are focused on equity in student learning. We have had many programs and many examples of where people want to say that the students that the students are deficient, that they bring deficits. But the deficits that they bring can be overcome. These are not things that in fact can't be addressed, even if they have had poor early education. I finished high school with all A's, but my education was not the strongest because we did not have the resources that we needed in order to be able to teach in ways that were pedagogically sound and appropriate for diverse students. And one of the most important things that I find within physics is the need to address the belief systems and the attitudes of faculty, to abandon the view of fixed student ability. It's amazing what a growth mindset will actually do when you, in fact, can accept that your students are not dumb, that they may be underprepared, but underprepared can be fixed. Okay, Beth, take it away.
I think Alexis was gonna see if there were any questions from the audience too for you.
There is one question for Shirley, but if we're just going to use 5 minutes in between, just to see if there are any particular questions. The question was being asked is comparing and contrasting the issues women face in the 20th century versus the 21st century. Do you have anything you want to, any comments on that, Shirley?
Well, I hate to say this, but in physics, they're not any different. The numbers just basically have this. I mean, I've looked at these numbers way out, and it just seems as though we just can't make headway. And we will improve a little bit, but then we'll go back. And I think that it is partly this notion of having inappropriate curriculum, inappropriate pedagogies that really build on women's life experiences and that connect culturally to these kinds of things. I think that maybe one of the biggest challenges is this fixed ability mindset, this notion that somehow you either have it or you don't, and that if you don't, we want to find out soon so we can get rid of you, kick you to the curb. We've been having this series of um, webinars, web events associated with talking about Leaving Revisited. And they talk about this over and over again, the weed out culture, this notion that somehow we can figure out who's going to be successful in our fields and we can get rid of the other people early on so we don't have to invest in them. And I think that in many cases, what we are not seeing is that we're not seeing the fact that women can't do the work. We are seeing that they're not being encouraged to stay, that they're not getting clear signals about their capacity or about their ability to be successful in these fields. And so this noise is coming in loud and clear that they need to abandon this field. And I think that it's to the detriment of the field, because one of the other things that we find out about within talking about Leaving Revisited is that you're losing the people that you want to keep. These are students who have high grade point average. They are essentially, they have the math capacity. These are not the people that you think they are. But because we don't monitor these things, we don't know that. And so we are satisfied somehow with having this drip, 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 this erosion of women. And it has gone on for a very long time. And I do not see an end in sight.
There's a few more questions to answer. Some of them are going to be a little easier. Can we download the data you presented anywhere?
Actually, the data, I mean, ask Rachel. Rachel
Yeah.
Ivy. And
I was
Rachel
gonna
would
say.
have the data.
Yep.
They are, it's quite clear that we have a problem. But it's not just a matter of looking at the national data. I think that it's really important for each department to look at its own data.
Mhm.
Who comes through your hands, and where are they a year later or 2 years later?
Mhm.
Do you in fact have people who identify as majors and then they're gone by the time that there's, so I think that this notion of needing to understand the circumstances is really important.
And we had a lot of questions, which we may revisit in the Q&A after Beth Ruedi has her.
Okay.
Yeah, but there's one other quick question I think would be useful just to end things. How do we get beyond the attitude that to solve the problem that students must be fit? What do we need to do for faculty?
I think I want to punt to Beth, because Beth begins to address the kinds of questions that
Mhm.
we need to ask ourselves within our departments, within our programs. Because until you acknowledge that you have a problem, it's going to be very difficult to really change that kind of attitude and belief system that the faculty are bringing.
Mhm.
So we can return to the issue in the general question.
That was a very good segue.
That's what I said. That was a
Yeah. I was like, oh, okay,
Thank you.
great.
And next will be Beth Ruedi, also from AAAS. Thank you so much, Shirley.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Alexis. It's lovely to see all of you, and thank you for coming to this. Just to kind of bounce off of, Shirley laid out the idea of kind of where we're at and why there's kind of no time like the present to start addressing these things. And first off, just want to say, why hasn't the needle moved? And I think Shirley was alluding to this a little bit. There's a lot of equip the individuals, which is a very nice way of saying fix the individuals, which typically means fix the women, fix the students of color, fix the faculty of color, when really what it is we need to start fixing the system. There are a lot of fantastic, what we call interventions. Intervention just means interruption of status quo. A lot of them reside down here in this pyramid where there's soft money, meaning that you've got grant support, and then you've got individual commitment, maybe up to the department level. But these are almost all volunteer efforts. Hopefully my internet isn't breaking up. I haven't been able to figure out how to get it to stop. Maybe I'll turn my camera off. There we go. I don't know if that's better or not. Hopefully it is. What we're trying to do with Sea Change is get everybody up to this top of the pyramid where you see the institutional commitment and the hard money. And hard money meaning that it is integrated into the budget of the department or the institution. And really that's where change actually begins to happen, is when something is considered so important that it is a part of the core budget that we're talking about here. You'll see in a lot of National Academies reports, you'll see in the AIP Team Up report, all sorts of calls for systemic change, culture change, systemic change. And that's what we're trying to get at here in the US. And we do actually have a model that seems to be fairly successful for gender equity thus far in the United Kingdom. I don't know how many people have heard of Athena Swan in the UK. It is a gender equality charter, and it was established officially as a big program in 2005, although it's been around since about 1999. And they've been able they've been around long enough that they've got 2 independent evaluations that are showing a definite change in climate and culture. Now, it takes a really long time to be able to truly measure changes in climate and culture. So they haven't been able to say that it's causative. They can say that it is a correlation, and it's definitely moving the needle in ways that we have not yet seen here in the US. They also began a separate race equality charter. So those are 2 different charters. I'm going to try using my video again because honestly, I like to talk with my hands. And then in Australia, a version of this program also launched in 2015. We launched in 2017 using some of the main kind of concepts behind Athena Swan and behind the Race Equality Charter, which involved that there's a set of principles that an institution or a department needs to sign on to, saying, yes, we believe that these are something that we want to try to advance. And we're going to behave according to these principles. But also there's a self-assessment framework. There's the idea of kind of working together with your community. And in 2019, something called Dimensions launched in Canada, and that's their version of this. So these are all kind of similar, I don't want to say sister initiatives because they're all adapted to the context of the various countries. But why AAAS? So there were 3 women who kind of saw what was happening with Athena Swan when they were over in Ireland on an exchange. And they noticed that Athena Swan seemed to be making a big difference with gender equity. And so they tried to bring this to OSTP in the US government. And wisely, the woman who was working there that they were speaking with was like, I don't think that this should really reside within the government in the US, but you should go talk to Shirley Malcom over at AAAS. And that makes sense to us. Our mission is to advance science, engineering, innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all. Sea Change really fits into that. Our hope, first of all, C is actually an acronym. It's STEM Equity Achievement, Sea Change. We're trying to provide the scaffolding to guide and support voluntary change. That's incredibly important. So the institutions or departments are voluntarily deciding to do this self-assessment, but it's also context specific. So within your institution and within your department, you're going to have a separate set of challenges that are barriers to true equity and inclusion. And so that's kind of coming back along to the question of we do a lot of things to help our students. This obviously isn't working. How do we help our faculty? It's kind of even bigger than that. It's more, how do we assess ourselves to know what our unique barriers and challenges are, and then how do we overcome those? And I know that everybody always wants, quick fix is the wrong word, but everybody wants answers, and wants them quickly. And unfortunately, you know, this has taken us decades to get ourselves into this mess. So it's going to take a fairly long time to get ourselves out. So there is no quick fix. But I think oftentimes just showing faculty the data, just the raw data, especially if you show it in terms of proportion of what's going on within the US Census, and how people are just not well represented. So even if they are plentiful, or their population is growing within the United States, that doesn't mean that they're included within a particular STEM discipline. And through this context-specific voluntary self-assessment process, we are hoping that an action plan and strategic planning will result in systemic transformation. We want it to align with the institutional mission. We want it to align with the departmental mission, not just the AAAS mission, or the missions of the different professional associations that we have the pleasure of working with. We'd like increased access to and inclusion in STEM education for all marginalized groups. But most importantly, this, like all things, is really based in a culture shift. So we're looking for a shift in culture such that diversity, equity, and inclusion is the norm. It's expected by every single focal population involved in your departments. This is going to result in a more diverse student population, which will result then in a more diverse workforce. And obviously, if a culture is more inclusive and equitable, it kind of doesn't matter what your background is, you're going to have higher retention rates, period. But most importantly, you'll have higher retention rates of BIPOC students and faculty. We also needed to adapt what Athena Swan, what SAGE, Dimensions, all of our international collaborators are doing in order to operate within the context of the United States. And that means that we had to really pay close attention, and we are still paying close attention to federal and state legal restrictions and guidelines. And that is something that is quite unique to us, and is not something that our international partners need to pay as much attention to. So it's a matter of navigating between what is legally permissible and what is legally sustainable, which is what we use to describe how do I make sure that I'm doing things in a way that works within the legal qualifications that we're given, that will still be able to advance the needle. And if we do, if somebody does not like something that we're doing and they decide to challenge us in court, what information do we need to have to show that we were truly operating within the bounds of the law? So we do a lot of work trying to help places understand that. That may not seem to be something that a department would need to worry about, but anything a department does really does end up reflecting on the institution as a whole. And then finally, as you noticed, within the UK, we've got a gender equity charter and we've got a race equality charter. And we know within the United States, looking at those things separately is not ideal. And we have a lot of work that's been done over decades looking at intersectional identities. And even before the term intersectional was officially coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, there was a report in 1976, it was published through AAAS, authored in part by Shirley Malcom, talking about the double bind. So what is it like to be a woman of color in STEM? And unfortunately, if you read that today, it is almost as applicable as it was in the 70s, which is, you know, it's a lot. So we're trying to help finally change. And so Sea Change, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're all about. We have 3 pillars now in Sea Change. It's not just the awards, even though we talk a great deal about awards. We have 3 pillars of Sea Change that constitute what we call institutional membership. We've got the Institute, the community, and then finally the awards. The Institute is a repository of resources. It has trainings. We're doing a lot of virtual events right now because nobody's doing anything face-to-face. Institute offerings, for the most part, are only for member institutions, but departments and other individuals and non-member institutions can access it for a fee. So far, because we're not fully launched, we're still in the process of launching. A lot of our events are actually available to the public, so anybody can join in. Especially if we're funded by federal funding. We try to make most of that information at least easily accessible to the public. Within the community, this will be open to everyone. There will be some members only areas. We're launching an IT infrastructure at the end of 2020 or the beginning of 2021 called Port of Call, and it will have a digital online community. We want to have moderated conversations, communities of learning and practice, and then eventually when we're able to all come back together in the world, we'll be having some face-to-face convenings as well that aren't just members only, and that'll be through the community element of Sea Change. And then this is the part that most people are more aware of, is the award structure. And that really is what they focus on in the UK. So Sea Change has institutional awards, and then it has departmental awards elements. And what this is systemic transformation really works best if you've got a simultaneous top-down and bottom-up pressure coming simultaneously. And that is what change literature has shown us. It really results in systemic transformation. So the institutional awards we launched in 2017 as pilots. It will go from pilot to full program starting in 2021. And that's looking at policies, practices, procedures, climate across the whole institution with a focus on STEM. The bottom up, as my colleagues in the UK always say, is probably the most important aspect of the programs over there and the most effective, because you're really doing a huge deep dive into more of the focal populations. So you can do a deeper dive into undergraduates, graduate students, postdoc staff, and that's looking at the policies, practices, procedures, and climate within a department. And as we all know, even if an institution is having a fantastic climate, it's a very welcoming environment, there are some departments within that are not very welcoming. And then we also have the reverse. So we'll have some departments that are doing incredible work, really great department, but the context that they're in within their full institution is problematic. So we're trying to kind of tackle those things simultaneously. Each of the types of awards has a bronze, silver, and gold. And these criteria are the same across our international partners. So in some ways that's kind of nice, because if you're a bronze institution or you're a bronze department, if you find an international partner department who's also bronze, you're kind of like, I know exactly what you did to get there. The idea of bronze is just to recognize the hard work of self-assessment and strategic action planning. So if you have done a self-assessment, not just quantitative, very importantly, it's mostly qualitative. You've identified some kind of key issues and barriers that are specific to your situation that you need to overcome. And then you've put together an action plan to address those and move your department forward or your institution forward. Then you'll receive a bronze award. I think I'm glitching again, so I'll stop my video again. Sorry, everybody. Silver is everything that bronze is, plus you're demonstrating the impact of your previous activity. And then gold is everything that silver is, but also a demonstration that you are serving as a beacon, as we say, in the sector or beyond. Meaning that if you have a departmental award and you've been involved in this initiative, maybe you decide to adopt a couple other departments within your institution, and that means that you're going beyond your own reach and actually reaching other parts of the institution. And very importantly, awards, you don't just get to have an award and then sit there and bask in the fact that you have an award, which I think would be lovely. But we've noticed when you end up losing money, like your advance grant runs out, things aren't institutionalized, you will end up seeing a lot of situations where there's backsliding. And I think one of the reasons that Athena Swan is so effective in the UK is because you're expected to renew your award. And so you can't just sit on the laurels of your first bronze and then just say we have a bronze. If you aren't showing that you are implementing the actions from your action plan and then reassessing priorities and putting more actions in place, even just to retain the bronze, you need to show that you're making some movement and you're implementing some of the things that you want to do. And so the struggle with that, as always, is trying to figure out how to make sure that it's not administratively burdensome to the departments or the institutions that are doing this, while also being holistic. And that's a challenge that I think all of the international partners will have to revisit over and over again as we iteratively refine our processes. This is generally what it looks like. So there's a self-assessment framework that a department or an institution is given. It's very detailed. You use it as a guide to gather information. You kind of see where there are gaps in your knowledge and your information. You try to answer as many questions as possible and try to make it as complete as possible. But most importantly, that is an internal self-assessment tool. So it's not that it's like a quiz where you're filling out a bunch of things and then you hand that in and somebody assesses it for you. There are some places that will do that. This really is just, you need to try to create a complete picture that is critical for your success. And then obviously you can't include all of that in an application, especially with COVID, resources are limited. So we need to make sure that we're prioritizing in a way that makes sense for any applicant. And that means you're gonna have to put some things to the side and say, we're gonna tackle this at a later time. What's handed in as part of an application is a department's story. So you got to provide the context. So why are our priorities considered priorities? What isn't a priority right now and why? And really just making clear that you have understood what your self-assessment is telling you. Too many times places will do a self-assessment and then they'll see some barriers, and instead of truly trying to dig deep and determine why those are barriers, they just take another initiative from another department that they've seen that they like, and they try to plop that into their own context. And that, frequently does not work that well. And then the action plan is the most fun part of all of this. So what are the plans moving forward? Why and how are issues prioritized the way they are? Are actions SMART? Definition of SMART down here: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time limited. And are they actually going to move the institution or the department to success? And that's all submitted. That's peer review panels. So it's not like AAAS or any of the other disciplinary society partners we have is going to go there and tell you one way or another. That's how this works. We get input from the sector itself, from experts within DEI, experts within higher education, experts within the discipline, who will tell us if they think that the action plan is set up to be successful. So I think a lot of places have questions. Why should I do this when I'm already doing these other 13 related projects that have to do with focusing on DEI? And that's a really good question. So one of the things that we're doing right now is just kind of trying to systematically go through all of the things that are offered by our disciplinary partners and demonstrate why and how those things are related to sea change. So you're not operating in a bubble. We don't want you to operate in a bubble. We want you to use everything that you're already doing when you do your self-assessment, when you try to come up with actions or implement them, and when you try to build capacity. So I've kind of got things laid out in those different buckets here, like self-assessment, action and implementation, and capacity building, and tried to map out some of the initiatives that some of your departments might be already involved in. So, Shirley was mentioning Rachel before. The Statistical Research Center within AIP is an absolute goldmine. You are likely collecting all of that information to submit it to AIP, so just use that quantitative information, and then you'll actually have something to compare it to nationally as a benchmark. Arlene Knowles, I'm sure most of you, hopefully most of you, all of you know her. She is involved in the Team Up report, and that report has gone from a report to a series of workshops and kind of an action an action initiative. And so using what is in the team up report as guidance for kind of barriers to remove for specifically for Black and African American students in physics. There's also a self-assessment guide, and there is an action plan or strategic guide guidance in there as well. So if you're doing that, you should use that for sea change. APS has site visits. There's also something called APS IDEA, which really the idea behind IDEA is capacity building to really make sure that DEI related initiatives are embedded into what your department does. So that again is focused on culture and capacity building. We've got the Society for Physics students. There are a plethora of different things available through SPS and other AIP organizations that you can use to put in your action plan, or even in your self-assessment. You know, how are you supporting your undergraduates? If you've got chapters, if you're asking your students to take advantage of the joint memberships between SPS and the wonderful groups and NABT and NSHP serving our marginalized physicists from marginalized groups, that is a very good thing to include in your self-assessment framework. So that's just that's an incredibly rough draft because I just started asking them for information about how we all align starting on Friday. So thank you for those of you on the call who filled that out. You are my heroes. So again, just to reiterate, we're hoping to change the culture without doubling administrative burden. That's like our #1 goal. The focus is on policies, programs, practices, and culture. It's for focal populations that are relevant to your departmental culture. Some departments don't have graduate students. Some departments don't have any undergraduates. So obviously you're not going to want to look at those populations within your self-assessment. You want to try to do a holistic self-assessment, but using what you already are doing and what you have available. And a lot of the first-time bronze really is just saying, we don't do that, or we don't know that. And we really do need to know that information in order to try to build up our department capacity for DEI. So a lot of it is just saying, I don't know this, I don't know that. Here's what we've prioritized, and here are the actions we're putting in place to figure out that information over the course of 5 years. Creating the action plan. Part of that creation of the action plan is building capacity and quote unquote institutionalizing. I put it in quotes because it's departmentalizing as well as institutionalizing. But seeing the inherent value of including DEI related efforts as part of a departmental budget, or the core group of things that maybe faculty are recognized for in their promotion and tenure, that's a huge change in culture that goes a really long way. And then the Sea Change Awards are they're intended to provide recognition for the work that you're already doing and for your plans to do more work in the future. Just wanted to give a shout out. Didn't really go into the difference between core criteria and more criteria. You'll hear all about that over the course of the next couple of months. We do have a very drafty draft currently of a departmental award self-assessment framework, and it was put together by this lovely group of humans. With a lot of help from me. They had to see me all the time. If you ever need to reach out to the AAAS Sea Change staff, in addition to reaching out to Alexis, here's all of our contact information, and I'm sure we'll probably make these slides available to you after the fact if you'd like them. But here are all of us. And now it's time for questions.
We got some questions while you were chatting. We're giving your talk. Thank you so much.
Oh gosh, you're welcome. I hope I didn't glitch too much.
It was fine on my end.
Good, excellent.
You might want to take the question slide down.
Yep, doing it.
So just starting from the bottom up, because I got lost. Are there any guidelines or best practices for coordinating what is done between other STEM departments like chemistry, math, or engineering?
Gosh, any guidelines about that? We don't have any particularly about how to interact with the other STEM departments or disciplines within your institution. But that being said, oh, it says sound is gone. Is sound actually gone for me?
No, we can hear you.
Okay.
I can hear you. I don't know. I mean, I hope my
know.
sound's working.
I don't even know. So I think that one of the best things that you can do is get your STEM departments across all disciplines to get together regularly, maybe once a quarter, and just start talking about what one another is doing for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And truly, that should be done also at the institutional level, but sometimes your institution isn't ready to do it. So I'm a big fan of just saying, when it comes to efforts that are informal, you can kind of do whatever you want whenever it makes sense to you. So designating somebody within a department as a diversity liaison and having a group of people who are the diversity liaisons across STEM meet on a regular basis is, I think, a really good idea.
Some of the advanced programs actually have this chairs training,
Mm-hmm.
which means that the people who are in leadership roles see each other on a fairly regular basis. But I think that it's a good question, because in many cases, your disciplines are being affected by the behavior of other departments.
Mm-hmm.
If the math people, for example, are not supporting what you need in terms of the mathematics that the students are needing in physics, that's a problem. It's also a problem if, in fact, they are not using um, physics examples or biology examples from other fields to help students really understand those kinds of linkages. But I know, for example, we already have data that bio has been losing students and other STEM fields have been losing students because of chemistry. So it isn't a matter of you're in or the boat is sinking. We're all in the same boat. And so I think that having those kinds of conversations is useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also somebody pointed out that I had said I had misnamed the society. It's
National
National
Society
Society for Black Physicists.
Black
It's
physicists.
it's just so many acronyms, so I apologize. And thank you so much for correcting me. I appreciate that. I'll make sure that's changed in the slides too.
So there's some extra questions about the logistics
Yeah.
of the sea change stuff. One of them is, what's the first step in getting involved?
I think that makes sense. The first step I would do for getting involved departmental wise is to contact you, Alexis. um, you can also contact any of the AAAS staff for questions. And if you can get your institution to get excited about possible membership and kind of get everybody on board, we're happy to talk to you about ways to do that strategically as well.
Right.
And my email address, which this is being recorded and will be uploaded to the AAPT YouTube, is aknaub as in boy at aapt.org, and it'll probably be in the descriptor anyway. Mm-hmm. And what kinds of people can get involved with helping this with the sea change self-assessment?
Yay, we love help.
Tenure track, or can the non-tenure track?
So getting involved with self-assessment, whether in the department or the institution, that is up to the department or the institution to put together their self-assessment team. But we do recommend that they are including voices from across the board, whether that be different career stages, different personal identities. And so that means that we're instructing peer reviewers, at least for the institutional awards, we're instructing them to look at the makeup of their self-assessment team for the application they prepared to make sure that the institution is walking the walk and not just talking the talk.
Great.
And to get involved in sea change just writ large, if you're interested in becoming a content reviewer or getting involved with sea change as a community guide, for instance, in the port of call once that launches, we do have a become a volunteer section on our website.
Here's another question. Can Canadian institutions get involved with sea change? And probably more broadly, can other institutions who are not US based get involved?
Yes, so involved in some ways, yes. Definitely not for
awards.
Yeah, not for the awards, at least not for right now. So for awards, your institution or your department should contact within Canada Dimensions, which is through NSERC, which is another acronym that I can't remember what it stands for, but it's the Canadian NSF for lack of a better term. And then for other countries, there are definitely other countries who before COVID had been looking into making their own adapted version of Athena Swan. I don't know where those things stand right now because the world kind of came to a stop. In terms of getting involved within the community element of sea change through the port of call, anybody who has a AAAS ID, which is free to get, can be part of this. So if you want to get involved in discussions or kind of see what's going on within digital communities, that is a good way to get involved. Even though we can't actually help you with awards or even necessarily with self-assessment, you can at least be involved with the community.
I saw a question or chat or what have you talking about the fact that nowadays that women are just about 50% of the students in astronomy get in terms of the degrees in astronomy and astrophysics, but the problems are still around issues of students of color. And you're right, there is often not a smooth path, but I think that in some cases there are opportunities for partnerships. For example, partnerships to introduce the astronomy and astrophysics through connecting to Hispanic serving institutions, through HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, and providing opportunities for students to be able to take those classes, have those experiences, and so on, because it's exciting and people want to go and do exciting things. And I would like to return to that last question to the first question that was the segue question, and that is, how do you change faculty? I'm not sure that you can change people's minds. You can change their behavior, however, and you can help them to by guiding them to look at their own data, not what they assume, not what their opinions are, but what are the actual facts. Are the students that they are losing really the ones that they want to lose, or are they ones that they would want to keep? And if that is the case, then they have to ask themselves, what did I do to make the student not feel welcomed in this field or in this department? Because it can't always be that there's something wrong with the student. There's nothing wrong with the student. Oftentimes, we just don't do the things that send a signal that we want them to stay. Or, as I sometimes say, Humpty Dumpty was pushed.
True and sad.
He didn't just fall.
Yeah, no, there was no fall.
Well, it is 2 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time because I know everyone has a million things to do. Do you, Beth, Ruedi, or Shirley, Malcolm, any final other thoughts besides Humpty Dumpty part?
I mean, so many thoughts, but if you want to just reach out to us, we can always answer further questions via email.
Yeah, and I put my notes chart.
There's one thing here, though, that I really want to end with. It says, how do I help a Black, Indigenous, person of color, POC student become more confident interacting with the more confident white male students? Which is an interesting question for somebody who was one of those students. I was one of 800 majors. I was the only Black major in zoology out of 800 majors. And I think that the issue is not so much to help the student feel confident, it is to help the other students understand that this student is bringing something special to the party, and that the notion of interacting as a colleague, as opposed to not including them in their study group, not including them in their conversations, not thinking that it's funny to basically exercise microaggressions.
Right.
I think that this is a community effort that people have to come to understand, that everyone has something to bring.
That was going to be how I was going to answer that too, looking at it is, in this case, why not make the white male students less confident, but why not make sure that that confidence is specifically empowering the students who are BIPOC? And I do think that changing the culture will change confidence levels quite a bit.
Yes, I think that's a great ending point. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you for all the wonderful questions. We didn't unfortunately get through all of them. There's a ton, but thank you again. Yeah. And in a few weeks, be on the lookout in your emails. There'll be another webinar. This one will be on department action teams, which some folks from CU Boulder originated, and they'll be telling you how to, like, a really cool model to make teams, basically. Well, thank you. And
Thanks, Alexis.
yep, I will stop the recording.